Good evening. It's good to see everyone this evening. We're finishing up Hebrews, getting close to the end. Be starting something different before too long. I think when we get into Hebrews 12, and I kind of wanted to back up a little. We talked a little about this last time. It says, in your struggle against sin, you've not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood, and have you completely forgotten the word of encouragement that was addressed to you as children? Do not make light of the Lord's discipline. Do not lose heart for when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines those who he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his child. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children, for what children are not disciplined by their father? If you are not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate children at all. How does God discipline us? Says that we're disciplined, right? Go ahead, Sam. Lay it on me. I think everybody goes through trials. You know, Christians, non-Christians, believers, non-believers. Obviously, you know, everyone has problems. Everybody goes through trials. That's just reality of life. But I think as Christians, we should view our trials in a different light. I think it really comes down to how we perceive things in our life, how we perceive difficulties, and how we deal with those difficulties. I think it's interesting how he starts this. I'm going to throw something out here, and I really don't want to make anybody mad, but you know how I am. And you think Jesus was a pacifist? How come? What's your reasoning?
He always was outspoken to the powers that be. He chastised them with his words, and he even went so far as to kick the tables over and drive them out of the temple. That is not pacifist to me.
So you think, so when he says you've not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood, what do you think that? And then he says he's going to discipline you. So what do you think? If you tie that together, tie that passage together, then how about a discipline? Do you think that's coming from other people, people they might want to have vengeance against? Do you think they don't have vengeance against them people? Why or why not? What's the Hebrew writer trying to say here? As Christians, they're persecuted by the Romans, they're persecuted by the Jews. And at the time of the book of Hebrews, they're not really being, well, they are being persecuted to the point of death, but nothing like what's going to come. It's bad, but it's going to get a lot worse, right? So, you know, at this particular point in history, you know, Stephen's been stoned by now, I'm sure. So we've already had martyrs. We've already had people that have been killed for the cause of Christ. So they're being discriminated against. They're probably being looked down upon, maybe in business practices, other ways by now. He says you haven't resisted to the point of shedding your blood. So in other words, they haven't become violent at this point. He says you haven't yet done it, right? So I think he's saying, well, maybe they would later on, but historically we know that they really didn't. You know, they just really didn't have a militant faction to Christianity through the first century, second century, into the third century. There really wasn't what you'd call a militant type movement. Now, there probably was a lot of reasons, maybe, for that. One is that they were very much under Roman rule, and it would be very difficult to have any kind of an uprising that would be in any way successful. I mean, you just wasn't hardly going to do that. And, you know, so there's reasons, maybe. But they were under a tremendous amount of persecution. The Hebrew writer says you haven't done it. The Hebrew writer says God's disciplining you by this persecution that you're going through, by the things that are going on in your life. So you're being disciplined in that. And yet, at this point in history, you haven't really been vengeful about that. You haven't really struck back. You know, you haven't really. And so he's really talking, and he's saying that if you don't undergo discipline, you're not a legitimate child. So discipline as the world is against them, is something that they have to endure, and something that, according to the Hebrew writers, is going to make them closer to God. So I think there's a lot, sometimes we say that, well, I don't know what, the Lord won't give you more than you can handle, which it's not necessarily a direct Bible idea, right? He will provide a means of escape, the Bible says, if you're tempted, right? But, you know, it's amazing what you can live through, right? So, you know, Christians go through really bad trials, not just here. I don't know if any of you looked at any of the Voice of the Martyr stuff. I had tried to look at that. I don't know if any of you looked at that or not, but if you look at Voice of the Martyrs, they've got stories on there about people that are going through tremendous persecution every day by the governments they live in. It's really severe. And how do they endure that? How do they go through that? Well, they do it because they're Christians, because they know there's a greater reward, because they know that they understand that's part maybe of the process where they live that God has laid out for them. And sometimes we place ourselves as Christians. We are persecuted. I don't think as much in this country. Do we place ourselves in a path of persecution? Some Christians do. Some do. There was a young lady lived in Claremore, a teenager girl, that when she got about 18, she decided, she would come and told her parents, she decided she was going to smuggle Bibles into Vietnam. And I don't know how you would react to that if you were a parent. I think that would definitely worry you. I would me. I think I'd probably try to talk them out of it. And maybe I shouldn't. But I think I would, because they're my kids, right? But she did. She smuggled Bibles, flew into Vietnam. They smuggled Bibles into Vietnam. She said when they got there, they took them to a warehouse, blindfolded them, took them to this warehouse, didn't know where they were. Middle of the night, a guy showed up on a motorcycle, put a blindfold on her, took her through the middle of wherever they were, and wound up at this place they were worshiping. And she said it was just a small room, like a 12 by 12 room, but it was literally wall to wall. And they'd pull the ceiling tiles out, and people were looking down from the ceiling to worship. They were so wanting to worship. And they wound up putting these Bibles in a false floor in a bus, and they drove way out in the country somewhere. And of course, they didn't look Vietnamese, you know, so they kind of knew they couldn't stay very long because they knew. But they had these Bibles in this false floor of this bus, so they opened them up and gave all these people these Bibles, and she flew back to the United States and lived through the experience. But you know, that's things me and you don't ever think about. But those are things that go on and things that people do to spread the gospel in the world. Gary says, you know, we have a hard time going to our neighbor and talking about Jesus Christ, right? You know, and there's people in the world that literally are risking their life to talk about Jesus. But the fascinating thing about these countries where that's the case is that these people are lining up to hear the gospel. You know, I mean, they're under persecution, the government's against them, but still these people are risking their lives, they're lining up, they're packing into these rooms. I mean, it's maybe because it's forbidden, it's sweeter, I don't know, but they're lining up to hear it. So there is persecution today for Christianity, and it goes on throughout the world, and it goes on in this country. And if you've been a Christian long enough, somebody's probably at least said something derogatory to you about your faith. I know they have me, and I probably am not alone. So he understands that, and he wants to say we need to submit to that. We need to submit to the Father of spirits and lives. Our parents discipline us for a while. God disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant, but painful. Later on, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. So, you know, discipline is something that we have to learn as Christians, how we deal with it, how we deal with conflict in our lives, how we deal with relationships. As Christians, we should learn to deal with that differently. I'm not always really good at that. I think I'm a lot better at it than I used to be, but I'm not always the best at that. But as Christians, we should deal with things differently. We should be different husbands. We should be different wives. We should be different children. If our children are saved, they should be different. We should be different employees. We should be different everywhere in the world. We should be different. People should understand by how we react, by what goes on, by how we deal with persecution, by how we deal with problems in our lives, that we're different. We look at the world different. And that's, Gary said another thing. You know, he said, you know, he's heard that said a lot. I'd rather see a sermon than hear a sermon anytime. And a lot of times it's how we deal with conflict and how we deal with issues in our lives where people do see Christ in us, because they know we react differently than what the world would react. So you and I, how do we deal with things in our life? How do we deal with problems in our life? And do we look to God for that? Do we look for Christ for that? Do we share with other Christians our failures? That's really hard to do, isn't it? You know, we don't like to share our failures. Nobody likes to share what goes wrong, right? But I'm a lot better at that than I used to be. When I come in here, I'm good at saying, well, I had a bad day. This happened or that happened or I messed up. I mean, you know, the truth is that, you know, we have to share our failures and our successes with each other. We should be comfortable doing that because we should be comfortable with each other. The idea of dealing with our problems, a lot of that comes with being open about the problems that we have. James says that we should confess our sins to one another and pray for one another so that we may be healed. You know, the idea of sharing your trials and sharing your conflicts and sharing your failures with people is really helpful in your life. You know, if you ever went to a therapist, therapists really don't do much, do they? They just listen to you a lot, you know, and nod and say, yeah, I understand, or yeah, I see how that is, or yeah, I can see where you're going with that. That's what therapists mostly do, right? They just listen to you. But you feel comfortable, right? You've paid them, and you feel like, well, I can share with them because it's confidential, and they're going to keep it to themselves, and they're not going to, and if they judge me, I don't really know them anyway, so if they judge me, that's okay, right? Because, you know, I'm going to walk out of here, and I'm not going to have to see them every day, so if they're going to put judgment on me, that's okay, right? But the truth is that as Christians, you know, we shouldn't have judgment on each other anyway. And for us to be able to share things in our life is valuable. It's valuable to us, and it's valuable for our well-being, our spiritual well-being and our physical well-being and our psychological well-being. To know somebody, truly to know somebody is what Christian fellowship is all about. He says to strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees. Make yourself strong. Make level paths for your seat, as the lame may not be disabled, right, but rather healed. You know, Christ is about healing, not about staying in our misery, right? You know, it's not about just wallowing in our misery, wallowing in our self-pity, wallowing in our failures or whatever it is. It's about healing. It's about moving forward with your life, changing your view, who you are and how you view the world. It's about not being negative about everything, not finding problems with everything. You know, that's what the world does. When you're not that way, people see a difference in you. I get pretty sour sometimes. Y'all that know me know that, you know. I get pretty sour. But I try to be better at that. I really do. Because I think people, you know, give them something they don't expect, right? Give them something they don't expect. Yeah.
When he started out earlier, didn't he tell them about Jesus as our sacrifice? And then he told them about having faith. And now he's saying, trust in God, that everything you go through, he's got a hand in it. And there's a promise that you'll receive at the end. There's victory at the end of this, no matter what goes on. Is that not what he's getting at here?
It is, but I think you got to be careful with that. Those of you that know me well know that one thing that really bothers me is when I go to a funeral or something really bad happens and somebody says, well, it's God's plan. God's got a plan. That drives me nuts. You know, if you know me well, you know that's true. I think that when a baby dies, God didn't will that. Or a young person dies, God didn't will that. I don't think that's God's plan. I think God can make another plan, right? I mean, God's God. So, do bad things happen? Sure, absolutely. I'm not a person that looks at every leaf that falls and every wind that blows as some great scheme of God's purpose. I refuse to live my life that way. I don't think we're predestined to walk a certain path. I don't think that everything that happens to me is predestined. I don't work that way. My view of God is way bigger than that, okay?
Well, not so much that everything is because he planned it that way, but that he's there with us through it.
Absolutely. You know, Romans 8 says that all things work together for good to those that love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. Doesn't say all things are good, doesn't say all things will be good, but it says for a Christian, for those that love God, it's going to work out for good. I believe that with all my heart. I do. But I'm not a person who, I cannot, in good conscience, believe that we serve a God who wills death. People have got an idea of God that, you know, God's will is going to be done regardless. Not true. Not true. The Bible never, ever backs that up. Because if God's will was always done, there would be no lost people. Am I right? Because God says he's long-suffering to us, word what? Not willing that any should perish. But yet more will be lost than be saved. Am I right? The idea of thinking, when Jesus prayed the Lord's Prayer, what did he pray? He says, I pray thy will be done. If God's will was always going to be done, why would he pray that? Right? Why would he even do that? Yeah, go ahead, Jennifer. Sure. But would deliverance come from another place? You know, you're quoting Esther, and you know, Esther's a book where the word God's never in the book of Esther, and Mordecai is just speaking Mordecai, not speaking. You understand what I'm saying? So, I mean, do you put it on a simpler scale? Okay? Do you think God wants anybody to steal? Do you think God wills anyone to steal? Real simple question. You think if I put $100 on a table and walked off and left in a room full of people, do you think somebody would take that $100? What's the odds? Give me the odds. So the point is that God's will is not irrevocable. It's not irrelevant. It's God's will doesn't necessarily always get done. And I think if you live your life in a way that you think, okay, everything is God's will, everything that happens is God's will, either one or two things is going to happen. Number one, you're just going to kind of quit trying because you're going to think, why should I try? Because everything's God's will anyway. And why should I pray? And why should I do these things? Because God's will is going to be done regardless of what I do. That's one thing that will happen to you. And the other thing that's going to happen to you is you're going to get very bitter towards a God who causes you grief. So I think we have to be careful with the view. I can get a little more personal about this if you want to. Yeah, go ahead. Absolutely. Do, does God will us to sin? Right. And through mistakes. Right? Yeah. Yeah, I understand. Yeah. Absolutely. When we see people go, and I've seen that so many times in my life, Christians who have faced death, and I've sat there and watched them die and talked to them when they're dying. And I mean, the things they've told me and the attitude and the ways they are, I mean, like you said, that's been huge in my faith, huge in my life to see that. I mean, that's been tremendous in my life to see that. I sat and watched my sister go through that. I watched my brother go through that. And many people in this congregation go through it, and it's always been a great source of faith to me to see how they deal with those trials. Absolutely. Exactly. Why would you pray? What do you pray for? You pray for. Yeah. Yeah, I've had conversations, and and we call it cotton candy Christianity. Me and Susie, and we talk about it. But health, wealth, and prosperity. There's a lot of those gospels that are preached. And to me, we just do a disservice to people when we put God in that way. And that when I was a kid, that was kind of how God was presented to me. Was be a Christian. Everything's going to be good. God's going to take care of you. God's going to lead you. God's going to guide you. God's going to and your life's going to be good, and everything's going to be great. And that was kind of how God was presented to me as a child. And as I got older, that was very disillusioning to me because I saw that that wasn't always true. I still had trials, and I still had problems, and I still had things that I had to go through. And so it became very disillusioning to me. And over the course of the last several years, I've really been working on this thing, although I haven't been able to preach a sermon on it, and I haven't wrote a book on it. But I've really been working on this thing of real faith, not cotton candy faith, but real faith. And I think there's a need for us to present people Christ in a real way. Let's not make it a cotton candy thing. Let's not make it we work so hard at getting people baptized and getting them out of the water, and that's all great, We work really hard at, quote, getting them saved. We're terrible at teaching. Gary brought it up. Percentages, people who stay faithful out of a study as compared to out of a sermon or we're terrible at teaching people to disciple, and that's really what Christianity is. It's discipleship, and that's what he's talking about here. And we're terrible at teaching people to disciple. And I think that, and I don't really know the answer to that as much as I wish I did, but I feel like that's where we really fall down, because we give people this cotton candy view of Christ, and then when they're saved and they become a Christian, and they expect immediately their whole life's going to just change. And that's not real faith. Real Christianity, real faith is the idea that change takes time, change takes effort, change takes pain, that there's a cost for being a Christian, there's a cost for discipleship, but the reward of heaven is much greater than that. If we don't teach people truthfully what Christianity is and what faith is and what grace is and all the things that go with God, if we don't give them a truthful view of that, then what happens is as soon as they get something bad happens in their life, we lose them. They fall away because they don't understand what discipleship. They don't understand what comes with being a Christian. And we have to move people. We have to not just save people, okay? Maybe I shouldn't say it that way. We have to teach people discipleship, because that's exactly what Christianity is. And that's the rewards of faith and the rewards of Christianity. Yeah. No, I think it speaks of faith to say your will be done. Sure, I think it speaks great faith to put God's will in your prayer, to say God's. And I've heard that argument both ways. I've heard the argument, well, we should just pray what we want and let God sort it out. But Christ prayed for God's will to be done, and I think it shows great faith to put God in the equation. I want God in the equation. God knows what I don't know. Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe that's kind of a deep theological dive off, but I think that it's. As Christians, we have trials. As Christians, bad things happen. Bad things have happened to me. Bad things have happened to you. And I'm not done. More bad things are going to happen. I'm sure of it. Huh? I don't know the answer. Yeah. Yeah, endure it as discipline for sure. Yeah. 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 I think it's like Gary says, you have to endure all hardship as discipline. I mean, I think as a Christian, that just kind of has to be our view. When we go through hardship, that's whether or not it's God disciplining us or whether or not it's just what's going on, it's how we deal with it is for our benefit, for our faith. Yeah. Well, I think it comes down to God's way bigger than we imagine. And we try to put God in a box a lot of times. And we try to do that because we find comfort in that idea. For somebody that's lost a child or lost somebody, especially out of season, a lot of people find comfort in the idea that, well, that's God's plan. God's got a bigger plan, God can use that to glory. God can make that work for good. But, I think when we start to do that and start to box God in, we really start to limit God. I think a lot of it's like Gary says. You got to pray for God's will. You got to understand God knows more than we know. God sees more than we know. God's the only one that can see tomorrow. Prayers are important. Prayers are valuable because we're not on a collision course with destiny, right? Prayer is what can influence, can change, can put people in our lives, can change things in our lives. We believe that. That's why we pray. That's why we should pray fervently, because God can change things. God can change things in our life. If someone's sick, absolutely pray for them. Put God's will in that. Pray for what you want. Pray for what you desire. As Gary often prays and does a great job praying for that, he says, my will is for this, but I want your will, If your will trumps my will, then that's what I want. Because I think that's kind of as Christians, that's where we have to be. Absolutely. We have a role. We have agency. That's what you would say. We have agency in our salvation. We have agency in our faith. We have agency in our relationship with God. If you really want to have true faith, you just have to understand, as all those people in Hebrews 11 we just looked at, all those people were faithful because they did something God wanted them to do. They were obedient to God's will. They had agency in that. God just didn't say you were faithful because you believe. God says you're faithful because your faith caused you to do something. Your faith caused you to step out. Your faith caused you to be different than the world around you. And as Christians, that's kind of how we need to look at our faith and our deal. It says, make every effort to live in peace with everyone and to be holy. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. The idea of holy is set apart. It's exactly what that word means. And it doesn't mean that you're, got a halo around your head, but holy means set apart, sanctified. I mean, it's something that you set to the side. That's Christians. That's who we should be. We should be set apart from the world. See that no one falls short of the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. He's talking about trouble within the church here. Make sure that doesn't happen. See that no one falls short of grace. You say, how can you do that? How can you fall short of the grace of God? And it comes right back to what he said in Hebrews 10. If you willfully sin, after you receive knowledge of the truth, continue in that sin, then you can fall short of God's grace. And once again, your agency, what you decide to do. God doesn't make you do it. It's what you decide to do. See that no one is sexually immoral or is godless like Esau, who for a single meal sold his inheritance rights as the oldest son. So he compares Esau to being godless because Esau didn't look to the future. Esau just looked at what was going on right then. He says, I'm hungry. Give me that soup or I'm going to starve. Right? And he didn't look past today. And the Hebrew writer is saying we have to look past today, past the here and now, past our wants and desires that are right in front of us today. We have to look past that. What is my desire today going to cost me tomorrow? What is that desire going to cost me? If we really looked at that, think of how many times people wouldn't get in those great big sins if they thought, what's this going to cost me tomorrow? Right? What's this going to cost me a month from now or a year from now? What's this going to cost me? You know, he brings up sexually immoral here. How many people might be tempted and be caught in that or be caught in an affair or whatever they do if they knew that a week from now, a month from now, it was going to cost their marriage. It was going to cost them to be with their children. It was going to cost them all them other things. We don't count the cost a lot of times, do we? What's it going to cost us tomorrow or the next week or the next year? If we really considered that, unlike Esau, who was godless, Esau said, I just want to eat now, right? He didn't think about tomorrow, right? So that's what he's comparing that. He says when he wanted to inherit his blessing, he was rejected. Even though he sought the blessing with tears, he could not change what he had done. He could not change the outcome of his actions. You know, that's the way we are in this world and life, right? We can be forgiven. God can forgive us. Other people can forgive us. But a lot of times when there's a sin in our lives, the cost of that sin still remains. Even though we can get forgiveness, we're still going to pay a price for our transgression. And we see that in the lives of so many people, and maybe in our own lives, things that we've done wrong. So it's something that we have to do. God was scary in the Old Testament, the Hebrew writer says. It was a mountain you couldn't touch it, right? Or you would die. It says, you not come to a mountain that can be touched, that is burning with fire, to darkness, gloom, and storm, to trumpet blast, or a voice speaking words who heard it, and beg no further word be spoken, because it could not bear what was commanded. If even an animal touches the mountain, it must be stoned to death. The sight was terrifying. Moses said, I'm trembling with fear. But you've come to Mount Zion. Zion in the Bible is always a city of God, always. Wherever that may be. And the Hebrew writer is saying that Zion now is in heaven, okay? The Jews thought, well, Zion was Jerusalem. That's where God dwelt. But the Hebrew writer is saying, no, that Zion now is in heaven. Zion's always where God dwells. The mountain where God dwells is Zion in the Bible. The city of the living God, heavenly Jerusalem. See, he puts it saying it's not here. Myriads of angels, if you read King James, more than you can count. The church of the firstborn, whose names are written in heaven. You have come to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. See to it that you not refuse him who speaks. If they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, how much less will we if we turn away from him who warns us from heaven? The Hebrew writer admonishes, stay faithful, right? Don't fall away. You're coming to Jesus Christ. Christ isn't scary like God was scary. We all believe that, right? The Old Testament God he was pretty scary. Am I right? Jesus to us is not scary. We see Jesus more as a friend, a companion, a savior. We see him as human. We see him as somebody who can sympathize with our weakness, and that's what the Hebrew writer is saying. So we're not coming to a God who we can't touch, who we can't feel, who we can't approach. Then that's the Hebrew writers brought that up. We can walk upright into the throne room of God. We're coming to a God who we can relate to, a God who we can touch, a God who we can talk to through prayer, a God who we can interact with, and a God who stands up for us and represents us. That's a really big thing for us as Christians. And it should give us comfort, and it should give us peace to know that God hears us all the time and that he takes care of us, that we have a God who we can relate to. It says at that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, once more will I shake not only the earth but the heavens. The words once more indicate a removing of what can be shaken, that is created things. And I think that really speaks to the end. And he's saying it's only going to be once more. When Jesus comes again, it's the end. It's not going to be a new beginning. It's not going to be a battle of Armageddon, not going to be a heavenly kingdom, not an earthly kingdom. That when he comes again, it's to destroy it, it's to be done with it. Zion is where God dwells, and the Hebrew writer says that's in heaven. The city of God is in heaven, not on earth. It's not going to come back to earth. The city of God's in heaven. And it says, since we're receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful and worship God acceptably with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. Worship's important, isn't it? Worship's important. We're supposed to worship God acceptably, right? With reverence and with awe. Worship should be reverent. It should be awe-inspired when we walk into the presence of God to worship. Worship is important. How we do it, why we do it, the heart we do it with is important for us as Christians. Thank you for your time. We're out of time.